I welcome you, and I'll turn it over to, I believe, Corey, you're first, and then we'll hand it over to K-Dads.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter. So yeah, I'm Corey Litwiller here with Public Consulting Group. I'll tell you a little bit more about PCG as we get into the call today. But really excited to share with this group about the 14C to CIE grant opportunity. And yeah, Peter, if you want to go to the next slide. Perfect. So I'm joined by my PCG colleagues here today that have worked with KDADS to develop this grant program. And you already heard from Peter. He's going to be talking a little bit more about um, the application logistics and giving some details on the grant program. And then we're also joined by Megan from KDADS. Megan, if you wanted to just quickly introduce yourself and then give a little bit of maybe background on where we are today with the grant program.
Yeah, sure. Thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to us discuss about the hard work we've been doing. I'm Megan Shepard, the Policy and Program Oversight Director for Long-Term Services and Supports at KDADS. As some of you may know, the SB 15 bill came out and offered a incentive to meet minimum wage matching. And over the last few months, KDADS, along with PCG, has been working hard to develop these grants to provide to you guys. And we're really excited to hear your feedback and answer any questions you have. We hope that, we can truly dive in and be able to provide a true integrated model to ensure that everyone, individuals who are living with disabilities, are paid equitable wages and are able to better become, citizens of Kansas and help them increase their goals. So I'll turn it back to PCG.
Great. Thanks, Megan. All right. And then, yeah, so what we plan to cover on today's call, like I said, we want to give a little bit of background on who we are at PCG and how we're involved with this grant opportunity. Then we'll give an overview of the 14C to CIE grant program, including, the overall purpose, and goal of the grant, the different funding rounds. You'll see that we're breaking things up into phase one of the grant and phase two, the requirements for application, and then also the logistics of applying, where you can access the application. We'll go through, in great detail what's included in the application, the information that you need to have handy, things like that. And then, we will have some time to open it up to questions at the end. If you have any questions as we go throughout the presentation here, feel free to put your questions in the QA feature in Teams. And then you also notice that folks do have the ability to unmute as well. We will ask that if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, at the end of the presentation today. We certainly want to get through, make sure that we have enough time to get through all of the relevant content here, since folks are going to be, the application is open. And so want to make sure that folks have a good direction after this call to start their applications. So yeah, hold questions to the end. But like I said, accepting, Q&A, feel free to put those into the Q&A module throughout the call as things come to you. All right, so let's move into talking about PCG's role. So yeah, want to give a little bit of background here. Public Consulting Group, just as the name suggests, is a public sector consulting firm that works specifically with state and local government, health, education, and human services agencies. And we've done a number of grants related work, especially, with some of the ARPA funds that have come out over the last several years. And we've been, working with KDADS on several grant initiatives, with the 14C grant being one of them. And so specifically what our role is in this grant is, we've been working with KDADS for months at this point on developing the grant program and the related materials, including the application, the RFA, and the associated resources that hopefully many of you were able to find on the grant website. We also are, supporting in the actual reviewing of applications once they're submitted. So, just making sure that entities meet the eligibility criteria, that, fields and information are filled out accurately for us to get a good picture of, your overall grant, forecasted budget, things like that. PCG will also be the entity that is sending out award letters and the notification of grant awards. So you'll be hearing from us throughout this process. And then finally, once awardees are approved through this grant program, PCG will have a process of collecting invoices for grant reimbursement as well. All right. So with that, we'll move into a little bit more of the overview of the grant program. And I think it makes sense for us to start really with the, talking about Senate Bill 15. So Senate Bill 15 was passed in 2024, and through this bill, it established a sheltered workshop transition fund. And so this fund is what the 14C grant is pulling from for the minimum wage matching component, to help transition sheltered workshops operating under a 14C certificate to pay at least the state minimum wage, which is currently at $7.25 an hour. And it also so that's a main focus of the grant funds, as well as helping to support providers transition away from sheltered workshop activities and towards competitive integrated employment. With that, it's a good opportunity for us to just mention where you can find all of the information that we're going to be covering today, which can be found in the request for application, or the RFA, that you'll commonly hear referred to. And so, like I said, we're going to go through in great detail all of the requirements, how to apply, all of that good stuff. But everything that we cover on today's call can be found in that overview document on the grant webpage. All right, so the overall purpose of the 14C to CIE grant, like I mentioned before when we were talking about the Senate bill and the overall purpose of those funds, is, like I said, assisting sheltered workshops with paying employees at least the state minimum wage, and supporting individuals with obtaining and maintaining competitive integrated employment, or CIE, as you'll commonly see it abbreviated. So when we talk about CIE, what exactly does this mean? This would mean that, employees with disabilities are compensated at or above the state minimum wage, that they're receiving the same level of benefits as employees without disabilities, working alongside and interacting with employees with or without disabilities, and then finally having those same opportunities for advancement in their work, again, similar to employees without disabilities. So those are going to be the main purposes and focus areas of the grant program. Now, you heard me mention earlier about the different funding rounds of the 14C grant. So we are conducting it in two phases. Phase one, and this is the phase that opened earlier this week, is focused on the minimum wage matching component. So the easiest way for me to describe this is like it's essentially a dollar for dollar wage match between the grant funds and the the provider wage expenses to bring employees up to that $7.25 an hour. So when we talk about and we go into the application details, you'll see that a lot of it is largely going to consist of, listing out all of your provider agencies' current sub-minimum wage employees, what their current roles are and their respective rates, and then calculating how much of a gap there is between, the current state minimum wage and their current wage, and then determining of that gap, how much is that is going to be reimbursed through the grant program versus how much needs to be matched by employer wage expenses. So that's phase one, and we'll talk a little bit about phase two, and what's coming up there. But like I said, the open application and the as we get into next fiscal year and we actually start the reimbursement, that's all going to be phase one focused for the time being. Now, phase two is going to be focused on supporting providers with the actual transition away from sheltered workshop activities. Um, and so the caveat here that I'll add for phase two is that phase two of the grant program will only occur if the grant funding is available. So right now, the state is currently working to confirm the funding availability for phase two as we get into next fiscal year. So as phase two occurs, it'll cover the different transition activities and the costs associated with those, such as admin costs for things like policy creation and revision, marketing and communications, staff recruiting and training, and new technology. So, in the coming months, we'll be sending out more communication and info about phase two. So stay tuned for that. But right now, like I said, we're going to focus primarily on the phase one application as it stands today. All right, so some application guidelines. Often we'll get questions on, if you're a provider with multiple locations, can you apply multiple times for the grant? We are telling folks that only one NPI can apply for the grant. So regardless of how many locations you have, it really should be one application per NPI. We'll talk a little bit about key dates here in just a moment, but just know that the application window, it opened on Monday, the 17th. It's open for about a month, and so we're planning to close it on Monday, April 14th at 5 p.m. Central. So you can access the application through the online, grant webpage and view the information there. All right, so who is eligible to apply for the grant? This grant only applies to providers who operate under a 14C certificate. So there's, it's a fairly small audience that we're working with, but that is the requirement to apply. All right, so next I want to talk about a couple of key dates to highlight here. So first things, questions from applicants are due this coming Monday, March 24th. So this will be our open question and answer period where as we get questions, we'll aggregate those and post those responses. Right now, there's an FAQ posted on the grant webpage. So what that's going to look like is once we get those questions submitted next Monday, we'll review, answer those questions, and post those as an amended FAQ to the website. So we'll be communicating more out of where you can find the updated FAQ with all of the questions and answers included. And then, like I mentioned before, applications are due in about a month on April 14th. It's a pretty simplified application process, all things considered. Like I said, because of how we're splitting up the phases, with this one really just being focused on the minimum wage matching. So yeah, simplified application process, but do certainly encourage applicants to get into the application sooner rather than later. Just give yourself a lay of the land, get a sense of the information that you need to gather beforehand, so you can get that entered and submitted on time. And then moving out or looking out past the application, as we get into May and June is when award decisions will be made, sending award letters and grant agreements with the anticipation of starting the invoicing and reimbursement process at the beginning of next fiscal year. All right. Now, for as far as the type of grant that this is considered a reimbursement-based grant. So what that means is that grantees must incur and pay expenses first, and then submit the proof of that payment for reimbursement. there may, in an instance where, maybe providers have started to already increase employees' wages or already started to transition away from sheltered workshop activities, we can only reimburse for the grant activities that have happened in the grant period. So there will be no prospective payments in advance of wage increases. There will be no retroactive payments for any wage increases before the grant period started. Um, the other piece here is that awarded applicants must match all reimbursed funds dollar for dollar from non-state resources. So the current amount that you'll pay the employee will be applied to the non-state portion. So we'll walk through a couple scenarios here in just a moment to kind of highlight if this is what the employee's wages currently sits at. Here's how much the grant funds will come in to match. All right, and then finally, if you want to learn more, I will encourage folks to visit the grant webpage if you haven't already. This is where you can access the application, any additional resources, and certainly if you have any questions regarding the grant program or the application process, please feel free to reach out to the email or phone number listed here on the slide. And with that, I'll hand it over to Peter to do a deeper dive into the grant requirements and application.
Thank you, Corey. So we'll start with phase one and just sort of walk through each of our phases in turn. So as Corey said, during phase one, we focus on wage reimbursements. So the state will provide grant funds to any grantees to help cover those wage increases so their employees can receive at least the state mandated minimum wage. And that's currently $7.25 per hour. So that's the number we're going to use in our future examples. But be aware, if that minimum wage changes, these parameters change along with it. The state will reimburse for up to half of that state mandated minimum wage. And the exact amount they reimburse for will depend on the employee's wage prior to, or I should say probably at the very start of the grant period. And that current wage, as Corey said, will be applied to the non-state portion of matching. So regarding those wage reimbursements, you must raise an employee's wage to at least the state mandated minimum wage to receive those matching grant funds. You can't stop short. But that being said, you may increase an employee's hourly wage above that state mandated minimum wage. We don't want to tell anybody to stop if you'd like to go further, but just be aware that the state will not provide matching grant funds for anything that goes over that state minimum wage, which, like I said, right now is $7.25. You will need to maintain some required documentation for your reimbursement. And as we said, that's only for wage increases during the grant period. So that supporting documentation should show the wage before the grant period, the wage during the grant period, so following the increase, and proof of payment for that increase in wage. So that could be things like payroll reports generated from your particular payroll software, could be check stubs, pay stubs, or direct deposit advice. A self-generated Excel spreadsheet, while we're happy to have it, is not acceptable documentation on its own. You would have to provide some of those other things I just mentioned. So let's talk a little bit more about sort of that split, the breakdown in the wage reimbursement. So this really depends, as we said, on your employee's wage before the grant period. So if you're already paying your employee more than $3.63 per hour, that's just half of the minimum wage, the state will then pay the difference between the employee's current wage and $7.25. We'll give some specific numbers in a second, but more or less what that says is if you pay more than $3.63, the state will reimburse you for the difference up to the minimum wage. As we mentioned, though, this is a reimbursement-based grant, so you will need to pay the increase yourself, after which the state will reimburse you. Now, the other case is if an employee makes less than half, so less than $3.63 per hour prior to the grant. In that case, the employer would pay the difference between the employee's current wage and $3.63. So you need to pay whatever's required to get the employee up to half, at which point the state would then pay the remaining $3.62 to bring their hourly wage up to the minimum wage. And again, Those sort of points in parentheses are just to emphasize that this is a reimbursement-based grant. So you would need to pay the amount yourself first, after which the state would then reimburse you. Just to show that sort of breakdown another way, here's an example wage reimbursement table. So it shows a series of different hourly wages prior to the grant period, then the portion of the wage increase the grantee would have to cover, and then obviously the portion of the increase the state will cover. So you can see as we drop below that midpoint, that 363, grantees need to pay a little bit more to reach that half, at which point the state will then cover the rest of the increase. As part of phase one, as Corey also mentioned, grantees commit to working with KUCD on a transition to CIE plan. So KUCD is part of this grant program as technical assistance and mentorship for awardees. So that transition to CIE plan will outline what any awardees need to do to transition away from sheltered workshop activities and towards competitive integrated employment. And that transition, to CIE plan is what will be involved in phase two once we get there. So phase two, as we said, moves to those transition to CIE plan activities. Awardees do commit to participating in phase two as a condition of the award. So as we said, you submit a transition to CIE plan in phase one, or I should say develop it with KUCD. You would then execute that plan as part of phase two if funding is available. So grantees can use their funds as reimbursements to those expenses related to those transition activities. And as I said, those are based in these steps in your approved transition to CIE plan, which you developed with KUCD in phase one. This is just an overview of some eligible expenses for phase two. I won't read through these all verbatim. They are all in the RFA, but it'll give you a good idea of some of the categories that are available for these expenses, which, as we said, will be in your transition plan. So we can cover things like admin costs. It can cover marketing and communication for informing the public about CIE. Can help for professional development, licensure, and credentials, things you need in order to support CIE. It'll also cover recruitment fees, if you need to post on job platforms, talk to recruiting forums for bringing in individuals to help find competitive integrated employment. It'll also apply to technology and equipment, hardware, software, office equipment, implementation costs, and protection plans for any of those devices. It will also cover training on, let's say, subjects related to this transition and the movement away from sheltered workshops. You can also books, trainers, fees for attending conferences, renting spaces for training, or buying or renting equipment. You'll also see here it can cover training related travel and accommodations, but there are certain conditions and levels of funding associated with that. So please do review the RFA if that's something you're interested in applying for. There are also training stipends, up to $50 for training and up to $250 per staff. And then indirect costs. You'll see when we get to the application itself that as part of your application, all grantees are approved for an automatic 10%, and that cannot exceed 25 grand over the lifetime of the grant. So again, supporting documentation. We talked about it for phase one. It's also required for phase two. So that could cover things like receipts, payroll reports, mileage calculations, or employee expense reports associated with training. It could be vendor invoices, or really any other means to reasonably justify whatever expense you're requesting reimbursement for. Proof of payment should include the date of service, a vendor name, a description of the goods, the total amount, and the payment method. So again, that's if you're proving you paid for a service or material. You must also provide a copy of a cleared check or your bank account, for verifying electronic payment. That is how any reimbursements will come through. All right, that then brings us to ineligible expenses, things that you cannot request reimbursement for. So this applies for all of those budget categories that I just walked through. So anything that supplants or replaces existing funding, costs incurred outside of the grant period. As Corey said, we will not cover anything before or after the designated grant period. Any payments for existing debts or loans, penalties for breaking contracts, costs already funded by another grant, any lobbying or political activities, entertainment, including social activities, transportation, if it's not directly related to staff members attending offsite training, any program supplies, care, personal supplies, food, or equipment for individuals receiving services, or any items that KDADs had denied during their application review. As I said, all of these are ineligible for requesting reimbursement. There's also a series of ineligible expenses by budget category. Again, I won't read them through all verbatim. So as we have throughout this presentation, we encourage you to review the RFA before you apply. But you can't cover any admin expenses not tied to a specific project. Same with marketing or advertising or any employment activities that don't meet requirements for CIE. This grant will not cover capital expenses if they are not necessary to transition from sheltered workshop activities or meet ADA standards. And as we said, we will not cover technology, equipment, or supplies given to employees or individuals receiving services for their permanent use. You also, any expenses, but especially training expenses, need to be directly related to transitioning away from sheltered workshop activities, and we can't pay staff to attend training during regular working hours. As I already mentioned, there is an automatic 10% for indirect costs, so we will not cover anything beyond that or indirect costs unrelated to this specific grant program. Finally, there are various miscellaneous costs that are ineligible. That includes onboarding and screening, hiring temporary staff, home office expenses, transportation expenses, or employee benefits. All of those are ineligible to request for reimbursement. That brings us to the grant application itself. So as we mentioned, you'll submit your online application through the online portal on JotForm. That's linked here. It's also linked to, or excuse me, linked from the grant webpage. And I'll ask one of my PCG folks to just drop that link to the webpage in the chat when we get a chance. You all should have received it by now in a few emails, but if you haven't, we'll make sure you get it. We went through the deadline already, April 14th by 5 p.m. Please do note you cannot edit your application after you submit it. Once it's in, it is final. So please do make sure you read through it. And if you have any technical problems, things like accessing the application, saving it, questions like that, you can email the KDAD's grants or call that number during regular business hours. Now, when you go to the JotForm portal, when you reach the application, this is the first screen you'll see. Just notice there you have that top line navigation to move between sections as necessary. And then at the bottom, you have your between page navigation and saving. So the second page of the application includes instructions for saving your application, creating an account, finding and saving your access link, and returning to a saved application. So really anything you would need to leave the application and come back into it at a later time. You can also find all these instructions in the grant FAQ and application guide on the grant webpage. You'll just see it at the very bottom of the page under helpful resources, along with a series of other documents, including the RFA. You start with just your minimum eligibility requirements. These just lay out, basically that you are eligible to apply and you acknowledge certain required uses for the funds. Next, you have your admin questions. That's just your name and NPI number. As Corey said, you can only apply once per NPI number. You'll also give contact information for your primary and secondary contacts, as well as the individual who will eventually sign your contract if you are awarded a grant. You then have your attestations. That just lays out some of the things we've already mentioned as requirements of the grant. So just to review, in order to continue participating in the grant program, that's contingent on no employees still being paid the minimum wage. That also means any employees you hire after your application must be paid at least that minimum wage. As we said, as a condition of participating in phase one, you also agree to work with KUCD on that transition to CIE plan. And if funding is available, you will then execute that approved plan. As we said during that proof of payment section, you must submit proof of payment to receive reimbursements for any eligible expenses. And you also agree that you will continue to pay employees at least the minimum wage after the grant ends. As we said, we want this to be a permanent and sustainable change. So that is a condition of funding. This then brings us to that minimum wage transition plan. This is different from your transition to CIE plan. This is an Excel sheet that you will upload as part of your grant application, and it gives a few details about your employees. So as part of this spreadsheet, you will submit the following for each employee: their name, their job, Medicaid ID, date of birth, gender, ethnicity, whether or not they have a guardian, the date they started with your organization, their current wage, and the hours worked per week. So as we said, you'll see this spreadsheet attached to the application. You'll just fill it out and upload it for your application. And you'll fill in these rows, this information, for each individual for whom you're requesting reimbursement for that wage increase. From there, you'll get to 4 required free response questions. The first is your strategy for ensuring the sustainability of the minimum wage increases. The next is the source of your non-state matching funds. So as we said, you need to match state funds with those non-state matching funds. You'll then explain how many employees you would expect to be paid at least the minimum wage by the end of the grant period. And at that point, will everybody be paid? And if not, when do you plan to transition all sub-minimum wage employees to at least the state mandated minimum wage? So all applicants will answer those 4 free response questions. We then get to attachments. So applicants here can upload any required or supplemental attachments. As I said earlier, that completed minimum wage transition plan is required. That's that Excel workbook that outlines the non-state and grant funds required to pay all your employees at least the minimum wage. And you can find that either attached to the application or on the grant webpage. That, I believe, is the only required attachment for this grant program. You can also add any supplemental materials or documents that will support your application. Those are purely optional, but we love to see it. We just ask that you sort of be aware that somebody will read whatever you upload. So we're not interested in, a 300-page business prospectus. Please do keep this relevant to your application and something you genuinely feel will support your plan, your application. That is the bulk of the application. That just leaves your closing section. So at this point, you can provide any other information you would like KDADs to know. You'll also list the contact information, the person who we will reach out to if we have any specific questions about your application itself. You'll then attest that your application is accurate, correct, and complete, and acknowledge once again that you cannot edit your application after you submit it. Once it's in, it is in. So again, please do reread it and make sure you're happy with it. At that point, let's say you've reread it, you've reviewed it, everything looks great, it's ready to go. You will then sign and date your submission. After you submit, let's hope everything goes well, sails right through, but if not, you might see an error view. So any questions with errors will be outlined in red. You can see that in the bottom screen grab. The top of the page will also display a running count of your errors. So here you can see there are 25 on the page. If you click that See Errors, you will move through them in order, and you can correct everything before moving to the next page. Okay, we have moved fairly quickly, so that gives us a lot of time remaining for questions. So we will throw things open now. You can add it to the chat, or you can add it to the Q&A section, or, excuse me, if you'd prefer, you can feel free to raise your hand, at which point we will then call on you and you can ask your question. So with that, I will throw it open to everyone for any questions. And forgive me as I just sort of move through the chat and read any we have out there. Okay. We have one question in the chat already regarding sort of the relationship between piecemeal work and this program. I should say up front, in certain cases, we might not be able to answer a question live just because of the conditions around ensuring there's a fair playing field for all applicants. So as Corey mentioned, we will have an FAQ document on the website, which we will then take all questions asked, compile our answers, post it there, and that will be up and running. I believe the 28th, Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, is the date we'll
Right.
have those answers posted. So in
Yeah.
those cases, thank you, Corey. In those cases where we can't answer it, as we said, you will find it there, and we will let you know when they are available to you. I believe, excuse me, Rachel, I believe your question is just such a question, which is the reason I bring it up. Rachel's asking if you can see that in the chat. Basically, if they can submit for reimbursement based on variable pay rates, things that might be for piecemeal work, things that are contingent on work completed. Corey, I believe this is probably something we'll want to say for the FAQ, but feel free to add something if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I just want to call out one thing. In the minimum wage matching spreadsheet, we do allow some flexibility where we understand that a sub-minimum wage employee might be working in different roles, and so they can be listed on the Excel spreadsheet more than once, depending on how many different roles they have, and understand that they have different hourly wages for those different roles. This question looks like it is like even within the same role, there's some variability on the wages. So with that piece, we may need to take that back and just consider that before we post to the FAQ.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Rachel,
so just to provide
please.
clarity in that, so yes, there is variability in the same role, and there is also variability in the task that day, whether it's the same role as not or not. So for example, we have individuals that are exceptional at folding boxes super quick, and they might wait, many can make above minimum wage or right close to it folding those boxes. But then if they're doing one of the more fine motor skill tasks like dotting bolts in the same day, it takes longer, or they're not as interested. So they're not as engaged, and they do a couple things, and then they go and talk to their friend, and then they do a couple things. So that wage can vary quite a bit throughout the day, for every single individual in that type of work setting.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. That is helpful context.
Other questions people have? Oh yeah, Rachel, do you have more to add?
I do have one more question,
Sure.
since no one else was raising their hand at the time. So one of the things that was outlined in the beginning of the training was that any dollars paid to subsidize wages should be paid outside of state dollars to be reimbursed later. I perceived that as you cannot use HCBS funding to subsidize those wages to then request reimbursement. Is that an accurate perception of what was stated?
Corey, I'll throw to you for confirmation. Rachel, I believe what you said is accurate under the no duplication restrictions we said earlier. That would be considered a duplication of fund if you used HCBS funding to cover the increase and then requested grant funds to then offset that as well. Corey, does that sound true to you?
Right. That's my understanding. Thanks, Peter.
So I guess my question is, HCBS dollars are not necessarily intended to subsidize wages. However, our workshop does not operate at a profit where we could double our payroll and still operate. So there is, with it being a reimbursement model, there's not profits available to subsidize those wages, which is why we are not paying minimum wage. If there were those profits available, we would be paying minimum wage. That's how these workshops are built to operate. So what dollars are expected to be used then to pay these payrolls to then be reimbursed through?
Rachel, I'm not sure if I can answer the second half of your question. I understand how numbers work, and that can be difficult. I will say just upfront, the reimbursement model is sort of a condition of the funding structure, right? That's the way the grant's required to operate, which is why we set it up the way it is. I don't know that I can give you sort of better advice on where to find those funds for the funding the actual increase prior to that reimbursement arriving. Corey, anything you'd like to say as well?
No, I don't think I have anything to add on that piece. It's good feedback, and it's something that we can take back as well.
Yeah, Jill. Jill, I see your hand raised. You should have the option to unmute whenever you'd like, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thanks. I'm just looking for some clarification. Can we apply for this grant if we want to keep center-based work as an option for people who choose to work in center-based work options, but paying them minimum wage alongside supporting people who are looking to work in a CIE option? So it is doing away with center-based work a stipulation of this grant?
Yeah, I can take that one, Peter. So grants are awarded based on meeting the requirements of the grant outlined in the RFA. It's not necessarily awarded based on needing to end center-based work. If a participant chooses center-based work, that's fine. However, it is good to just note that Medicaid funds are not available for supporting that service. So, whether or not a provider continues with center-based work is not really a Medicaid choice, but just a business decision for the provider. So, just wanted to add that caveat as it relates to this grant.
Okay.
Thank you, Jill. We have plenty of time, and we're more than happy to stay for the whole time. So any other questions people have, we're happy to hear them. Yeah, Rachel, another question.
Yeah, just a clarifying statement, Corey, that you made. You said that Medicaid funds will not be available for center-based work. Is that based on the proposed day service unbundling that is currently still being edited, or can you tell me where that statement is coming from?
Yeah, I do believe, I might nominate if someone wants to add to this, either on the PCG or the KDAD side. I do know that I think the unbundling of the day services does tie into that. But I know, as we look in the medium to long term, that those services are not going to be reimbursable by Medicaid.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Rachel, I think we're still, as you know, developing some of those definitions, but the goal is ultimately to get out of that model. And I think that's why we want to provide this support and also provide that support from KU. So we're still supporting those individuals that like that model, but also seeking a transition plan to see how we can provide some more community integration, and also working with them on their person-centered support plan.
Yeah,
Does
so
that help?
a little bit. I really appreciate this discussion. I just want to make sure I understand where we're at. And you said the goal is to get away from that model. And while I understand certain stakeholders have goals to get away from 14C, for example, some
Right.
stakeholders might have a goal to get away from center-based. Whose goal is it to get away from that model when we're talking center-based work, and where do the individuals who choose this option come into that? Because stating the goal is to get away from that is a little bit concerning to me when we still haven't settled on this is exactly what the future holds and here's what the stakeholders are wanting.
Right. I hear your concern, and I think that, for this grant, the legislative intent was to provide that minimum wage matching and that transition plan. And that's the goal here with, I think long-term goal outside of this grant is a little bit different on how we lay on that. But, for the intent of this grant, it's to provide that minimum wage, and then that work with KU to transition out of that model. And maybe that part two of that transition plan, when we work, if that budget gets approved, we work through some of those things like that. Does that make sense?
Yes, just to clarify, the intent from my perspective and my understanding is to get away from sub-minimum wage and offer incentive for removal, or getting away from sub-minimum wage, not getting away from center-based work. So that question was about center-based work models, which doesn't necessarily mean it's sub-minimum wage.
Rachel, this is Michelle. That's true, but part of our corrective action plan with CMS is that center-based work, whether it's paid sub-minimum wage or at minimum wage or above, is not an integrated setting. And so we're looking at the setting's final rule. There's a national movement to move away from sub-minimum wages. I'm sure you're aware. So these are the kind of this legislative intent is to help providers make that transition into a different model for service. And this is a 10-year process as it was set out by the Kansas legislature.
Eileen, I see. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry,
Well,
Rachel. Did you?
with all due respect to what's being said, some of us have been participating now in work groups where KDADS has stated that, it was not the intent to restrict placement in receiving pre-vocational services in a work center for a 6-month period with
Right.
2 6-month periods within a 24-month. So, we're having all these conversations, and we have a legislature, who I think has been now led to believe that the state was backing away from that, and a legislature that never set out in this legislation that we're talking about that provided for the funding for this grant. That legislature never indicated that work centers had to completely cease existing, rather that the 14C certificate was something that providers were willing to move away from so that a minimum wage would be offered. So I'm just a little confused by the conversation we're currently having.
So Eileen, I think the intent of the legislation, Interhab was instrumental in getting the funds for this and laid out a 10-year plan for this to move away from. The first part of that was to get the wages up to at least minimum wage. The second part was a transition plan. And part of that transition is to make us compliant with the settings rule so that people are working and playing in more integrated settings. But it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen in 6 months. It's going to be based on people's individual preferences. But HCBS is very clear that they expect all settings to be compliant and be integrated. So that's what we are working towards right now.
I believe we
I just
covered.
want
Oh
to
yeah,
note
Rachel.
one more thing. I put this in the chat, but I think there's some generalizations and large statements that become very confusing for providers who are very very logistical about every little implication. And Michelle, I just wanted to note you just stated that final rule wants every single setting to be integrated and compliant. And I know that sometimes we can say things and intend something differently, but that's a big statement when you're looking at final rule applying to residential homes and final rule applying to provider owned and operated settings and employment settings and general businesses. So that's a statement makes me feel that every single home that individuals live in then have to be fully integrated, which is not how our system operates, or that every provider building would have to be fully integrated. So I just, when we're asking these very specific questions, they sometimes get more confused or confounded by these large general idealistic types of statements. While we don't disagree with kind of those overarching methods, it's hard to understand how to operate with this grant right now based on those types of things. Do you get that?
I understand, and I don't mean to cause confusion. What I'm trying to say is that our overall goal is to come in compliance with the settings final rule, making sure people have opportunities for integration. You may live with another person with a developmental disability. That's fine. That's your choice. But you also have the opportunity to get out and do things. And the unbundling of the day services is also an opportunity to have more choice on what you do during the day. We'll still have pre-vocational in there. But the point of this particular Senate Bill 115 is to help pre-vocational services transition, help the people that are in those sheltered workshops transition to other kinds of services.
With that, I'd like to thank everybody. I mean, we definitely appreciate all this engagement, especially in the chat, we see these things. I feel like at this point, we've gotten a little bit of feel of the grant itself, which is what sort of, brought us here to discuss it. So because we have only a few minutes left, we do still have time for more questions, but if we can refocus those questions on grant specifics, and we can save these larger discussions for another venue.
Okay, I promise this is not a soapbox, big philosophical discussion. Just clarification. The questions we did discuss that were grant specific today, do we need to resubmit those per that deadline, or will those that we discussed today be in that FAQ?
Yeah, we will take everything we discussed and add it to the FAQ. And as we said, we'll also put all this on the webpage as well, the recording and the slides. Then Corey, with that, I will hand things back to you. Just our sort of final wrap up and discussion of some other grants we have running. Oh, I apologize. This is actually me, Corey. So let me keep talking. So we do have a few other grant programs running concurrently with SB 15. So if you attended our community support waiver town hall, you heard a little bit about some of these. But another of our grant is the New Day Services Transformation Grant. So that's designed to help HCBS day services providers modify their programs to align with those proposed unbundled day services definitions and to gain or renew accreditations and offer professional development opportunities, again, related to that unbundling. So the deadline for that is the 14th. We also have a web page for this one. You can see some quick links to it if you go to that 14C to CIE webpage. But we will have another version of this pre-bid conference, but for the New Day grant on Monday, March 24th, so this Monday. So if you'd like to attend that, if this seems relevant to your organization as well, we encourage you to join us then to find out a little bit more. The other one we have is the Conflict-Free Kansas Grant. So this again is to help providers comply with that settings final rule and other federal regulations around conflicts of interest. So that could be community service providers, CDDOs, or any agencies providing targeted case management, So that one opens this Monday, hasn't quite started yet. And the deadline there is April 28th. And we have a associated website and mailing list for this one. If I can ask some PCG people to drop that URL in the chat, just in case people want to visit it. And we will have a pre-bid conference for this one on Thursday, March 27th. So if you'll forgive me, I'll backpedal just a little bit. Again, that New Day Grant pre-bid conference is Monday, the 24th, and the CFK one is Thursday, March 27th. So Corey, at this point, I will hand things over to you for any sort of final words you'd like to share.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Peter. And so, really appreciate all of the participation discussion today. As Peter said, we'll follow up with the questions in the FAQ. You all will get notified of that. And please don't hesitate to reach out, even after the open question answer period. The phone number and email inbox that was provided in this presentation is a great way to communicate with us, especially around logistics of filling out the application, the information needed, things like that. So we're here to support, and really appreciate everyone today. Thank you.
Hey, Dads, any last things you'd like to say before we end things for today?
Just say thank you for your time and effort. So have a great day.
Thank you. Then,
Thank
as
you.
Corey said, check out the webpage. You can find things there. And otherwise, we'll end things for the day.